flipping the table.
This is Michael, and it's Season 2 of Flipping the Table. This is a podcast featuring honest conversations about food, farming, and the future. I do this because I'm inspired by all the people you will hear. Some of them I've known for decades, and others I've just met. But each of them are creating the knowledge, the food enterprises, farms, and ranches that will make for a future that works better for us all. You know what it's like when you meet someone and think, wow, I like that person. I think we'll be friends. Well, that was my experience with Alan Katz, the co-founder of New York Distilling Company based in Brooklyn. We met back in the fall of 1999 or the spring of 2000. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember it was the first national gathering of slow food leaders from across the nation. It was in a beautiful barn in Bolinas, California, owned by Susie Tompkins Buell of Esprit fame, and it was hosted by Alice Waters and the team from Chez Panisse. They prepared delicious food for the 60 or so people gathered. Their offerings reflected the highest ideals of slow food: good, clean, and fair from local organic producers. Alan stuck out above the many gifted and talented people in that barn. His passion for quality, his ability to clearly articulate an inspiring future for a then young movement here in the U.S. His words and ability to connect with people around him created a respect and admiration that has never waned. Alan and I worked together on the Slow Food USA board for many years, meeting several times a year in different U.S. cities and abroad. Whenever I was in New York, we would break bread in some of his favorite restaurants. He arranged for my 50th birthday celebration at David Chang's Momofuku Sambar, where I met the august chef in the East Village of New York. Alan became the chair of the Slow Food USA board when I stepped down from that position in 2006. And he led the board at the organization's highest point during the giant Slow Food Nation event in San Francisco in 2008, where the food movement first made the front pages of the New York Times. Alan is one of the nation's leading experts on distilled spirits and cocktails. He has been at the center of the explosion of interest in mixology. He traveled the nation as director of the Spirits Education and Mixology for Southern Wine and Spirits of New York to teach how to mix exciting, enjoyable cocktails and the history of those cocktails. I would often listen to his radio segments when he hosted the Cocktail Hour for Martha Stewart on Sirius XM. He is responsible for raising tons of money for nonprofits and a wide array of issues, particularly healthy, good food. At slow food gatherings, he was the host behind the aperitifs that welcomed folks and were designed to stimulate our appetites for delicious foods and meaningful human interaction. The sharing of experience and visions for transformation of the food system. I've always been struck by the fact that we call distilled alcohol spirits because they do, when consumed responsibly, open the heart and mind to warm connections among people. Alan is among the best examples of conviviality that I've ever known. He is also a passionate entrepreneur and joined with the father and son team of Tom and Bill Potter to found New York Distilling Company back in 2011. They actually opened on December 5th, which was the anniversary of the end of Prohibition. So in today's conversation, we will explore the life of a mixologist, distiller, and promoter of conviviality, who has had a very interesting life. I know you will enjoy my conversation with Alan Katz. Alan, it's great to be with you here in the New York Distilling Company in Brooklyn. It's a beautiful place, very cool, and I'm glad you could join me today.
Welcome back. It's good to have you here.
Yeah. So, why don't you, talk about how you came to be a founder of the New York Distilling Company?
My pleasure. It's a fun story for me personally because it takes a meandering route, and that's sort of been, I think, since I was 5 or 6 years old.
Wow.
The basic concept, encouraged by my parents, to find something that you love to do and sink into it with everything that you've got. And for me, I knew as a teenager I wanted to be in New York City. I always felt the energy, like many people do, but I just didn't know what I would be doing. And I pursued music when I first moved here, and like many people do.
Didn't you work for someone really famous?
No, I mean, I was meandering around and trying to work with composers and thought I might pursue conducting or singing. And look, we're a dime a dozen, that breed that's here in New York City. And as most of us do, we get into the hospitality industry. And I worked in bars and restaurants, and I loved it. I was able to pay my bills, but I really enjoyed it as well. And I had never, by the time I was in my mid-20s, I had never been out of the country before. And good friends of mine who were still making a go of it in rock bands and funk bands, they were going to Europe every summer, particularly Germany. And they would come back at the end of the summer, Alan, you've got to go to Europe. Everything is in Europe. They would come back, tell me stories of the time they had. They got to play their own music and eat food, and they came back with a few dollars in their pocket. And so I thought, well, I'll go someplace that keys in on my passions, food and music, and in particular someplace where they didn't speak English, that I felt I could get mentally lost in an adventure. And so I loosely planned a 6-week trip to Italy. And this was...
Yeah, what year was that?
Maybe 1997. And importantly, pre-Euro, pre-9/11, of course. And I went, and I had a great time just traveling a big triangle between Milan, Venice, and Rome. And if I liked a place, I'd stay a few days. If not, I'd try and find a good lunch, enjoy myself, and get on the bus or the train and meander a little bit more. And of all things, of wonderful fortune, I met a couple of women in Tuscany who were opening a cooking school that was meant to be recreational 8 months of the year and professional 3 months of the year, and in the dead of August they would close down. And we hit it off.
Was that in Florence?
That was near Lucca, in a little town called Massarosa, between Lucca and Viareggio on the coast, the northwest coast of Tuscany. And they said, you should come work with us. I said, you've got to be kidding me. Well, you'll cook, you'll teach about wine. I had never taught about wine. I love drinking wine, but it sounded like a wonderful fantasy. And so there was nothing that I had to really drop. That was mid-October. I was back on January 4th of the following year and spent almost 2.5 years working and then helping to run this cooking school in Italy. Wow. And when the Italophile bug hit, and it hit hard, and I enjoyed it immensely, learned a lot about myself. I'd never been in such close proximity to ingredients from a cooking standpoint, where we picked herbs and vegetables every day. And we went to the bakery every morning. And we went to the butcher when we wanted meat, and the fishmonger, because the coast was 15 minutes away. The fishmonger was there 2 days a week. And that's when we went to the fishmonger. So it was a really incredible feeling. And having been in New York for several years already at that point, if I relate the experience in Italy just to something that's now as common as the New York City Green Market Network, there was still wrapped iceberg lettuce at the Green Market in the early mid-90s. There was starting to be plentiful varieties as well, but you could still go and there was the plastic wrapped iceberg lettuce. And so I was not aware that these changes were afoot, that people were going to pay attention to points of origin, let alone who actually produced their food. And so every Wednesday I would go into town and go to this little wine shop operated by a most beautiful, and I mean physically beautiful, brother and sister, young group, on Via Zanardelli in Viareggio. I don't remember the name of the store. And the wines that we would kill for today were so inexpensive that on my meager wages, I could pay a few dollars and buy wines that would probably be hundreds of dollars today, stereotypically, but plastered all over their store. And many others were little slow food insignias. And I paid virtually no attention to it, except that it was in English, and my musical ear was starting to pick up Italian. But I just sort of put it in the virtual folder of, that's interesting. And ultimately, I decided, well, it's time to come back to New York. And I didn't have a specific direction. I figured, well, we'll meander some more. Have always been good at finding my way to reasonable work and interesting work. And I did. When I got back, I started doing some food consulting, and I started writing business plans for a restaurant, an Italian wine bar, an Italian restaurant that served just one 3-course meal a day but sourced wines from all over the world. None of these visions ever came to reality. But I was working, and I was having a good time. And I pulled out of that virtual folder, maybe there actually was a card from that little wine shop that said slow food. And at the time, maybe it still exists, 411 for information. And I dialed 411 and asked for slow food, as if, well, maybe this exists, and in a bit of melancholy as to why did I leave paradise in northwest Tuscany? And it was. And someone picked up the phone.
No.
And I said, well, I could be a volunteer. I think
Was that Patrick Barton?
That was Patrick.
Oh, my God.
And Patrick picked up the phone. And
He was the executive director.
He was
at
the
time.
executive director out of his apartment on the Upper East Side. And I lived on the East Side, but I always called it no man's land between Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown. So I can get there. And I became, one of the early Uber volunteers, literally stuffing envelopes, but interacting with many people, Patrick's counterparts or colleagues from Italy. And it was a way for me just to hold on to that breath of my Italian experience and say, maybe one day. The greatest fantasy was I was going to open a wine school for Americans in Italy. Also never came to fruition. So in those early days, it was really just about the concept of holding on to Italian culture, Italian food culture. And over the years, I became as involved as I possibly could be, spending more time as a volunteer than I actually did for any specific work, probably over the course of 6, 7, 8 years.
You became the head of Slow Food New York.
I did, well, that was easy, becoming head of Slow Food New York. There was a great interested group of people here. And as slow food began to evolve and grow, as you know, there became regional volunteer roles and national volunteer roles. And it was, for me, having a marvelous upbringing, not just with my parents, but with my family as great influencers on me, slow food and that experience was equal to that influence. And I was in my late 20s, and then a little bit older as time passed on, but it was that significant for me in a thought process, personal evolution. And ultimately, I had a few significant mentors, yourself included.
No.
I'm serious. That for me, it was leading by example. Very much and very honestly, not just by perhaps a generational difference, but by a difference of experience and a coastal difference. And I had always described myself as an advocate, a kind person who wanted to do advocacy work for others where I could be useful or helpful. And the difference was between you and particularly your friends and colleagues in California is, tell me if I'm wrong, that you would use the word more so than advocacy, activism. And I had never really thought of myself or even found a comfort zone until those perhaps heyday years of the origins of not just Salone, but the other,
Big slow food events.
the big slow food events that became not just social, but political and educational, where it was extremely humbling for me to go to international events and meet people, with all honesty, from countries I had never heard of.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite weep about it, but it was truly humbling to say, I want to be a person involved in this community as an advocate and an activist where it makes the most sense. And it was my experience in Italy and then my broader experience in slow food internationally and also primarily in the United States that led me to a great personal philosophical question. Here we go. What, if anything, could be considered authentic American gastronomy? And that's really the launching part for me in my early 30s in self-discovery and communal discovery and celebration of American cocktail culture. And being able to travel to different cities in this country, in our country, and discover their food sensibility, their own food culture, it really dawned on me over a period of time that there is barbecue, the height of authentic American
I
gastronomy.
remember you were going to the South.
And then cocktail culture. And we don't own it wholly, but I'll give ourselves 96% of it. And people typically laugh off cocktails and cocktail culture. And at this point, since we're podcasting, I call bullshit because it's immensely key to political evolution, social evolution, things as simple as men and women and then people of different cultures actually drinking together with societal approval. And so I enjoyed that combining of all these interests. And all of a sudden, I thought, well, how am I going to turn this into a livelihood? Well, I open a cocktail bar or go back to the restaurant idea. And I settled on the idea of making something from scratch. And I had been increasingly invited to distilleries. And people would say, oh, have you ever been to our distillery? Big name brands. Your distillery? I've never been to any distillery.
Now, you were doing you were like a mixologist. I mean, you were going around teaching people how to mix.
I
right?
was. I went back. I had been a adequately serviceable bartender when I moved to New York. I was not paying attention, as I often like to say, to what rum was in the well, or whether the limes were from California or Mexico at a given time of year, or whether we were using a specific type of sugar to make a daiquiri. I just wanted to make a decent drink. It was cash in my pocket. It was very social, and I had the stamina in those days to do it. And throughout the interweaving of my slow food experience, I went back to the ingredients. Why this rum? Why this gin? Why this Amaro or any other ingredient? And I wish I'd kept a notebook. Quite stupidly, I kept all of my notes on Post-it notes. And I would tape them to the back of bottles because I would be doing comparisons by ratios and using different ingredients. And there's some, being in New York or other big cities, here there are wonderful access to particularly Middle Eastern stores with an array of ingredients, different salts, sugars, syrups. And I just loaded up on those and was making cocktails from 19th century cocktail books.
Wow.
So when I went back to it, it was a little bit self-taught. But in those days, which is now 98, 99, there weren't a lot of people doing it. And it was quite easy to get around and, dare I say, make a name for myself and say, oh, he's a cocktail guy. And as I said, wonderfully, got invited to see distilleries in person. And that's when I started taking notebooks with me. And I started, in the course of maybe 3 years, I probably went to 30 distilleries.
Wow.
And
All in the U.S.?
No, I went to distilleries in Mexico, in France, in the UK, including England and Scotland, certainly in Kentucky and Tennessee, and a few other places as well. But it was a visit specifically to the Plymouth Gin Distillery in Plymouth, England.
I remember that, yes.
And that was the thunderbolt moment.
Wow.
For those that have never been there. You think of a distillery in Kentucky or Tennessee, and it's on farmland and the pastoral hills, and there are beavers in the creek, and so forth and so on. Plymouth is an urban distillery. And it bowled me over, and I couldn't sleep. And I thought, my goodness, this is something interesting. Maybe I could open a distillery in New York City.
Wow.
And the people
What year was that?
The first visit to Plymouth was probably around 2002, 2003.
It was after 9/11. No.
It was after 9/11. Yeah, it's It's 16 years. It's 2002 or 2003 for certain. And it made me haywire. And I went back even further to say, I need to really pay attention to ingredients. And gin wasn't the end all be all, at least in my world, that it is now. I mean, every county in the land seems to have a dozen gins of its own, because if you're going to open a distillery, you can start by making gin. But back in those days, I thought, well, we'll make gin and rye whiskey. Classic cocktail ingredients
Right.
from the 19th century. But we'll look backward and forward at the same time. We'll put our own spin on them from a usability standpoint.
How did Mount Vernon, the project you did, the
Sure.
rye project you did with Mount, was it rye?
It was. Well, George Washington, we always say, was the first commercial rye whiskey distiller. He made more money the last 2 years of his life, only ended because he died, than the rest of his careers combined.
Wow.
He had a Scotch foreman at Mount Vernon who said, I think we can make some good whiskey here, Mr. President. And they started. And there's a beautiful grist mill at Mount Vernon. And
They were refurbishing that.
well,
they
they
hired you.
they didn't hire me, but I'm good at finding my way. I'm happy to volunteer for anything that will be educational. And through the largesse of some of the largest alcohol companies in the country and the world, they raised several $1 million to not just unearth with a full-time team of archaeologists that works at Mount Vernon, but to take the foundation and rebuild a 5-still distillery there that is beautiful.
Wow.
And a few times a year, they'll distill it. The laws down there are a little restrictive, but they have dispensation to sell whatever they make, and it benefits Mount Vernon. But the people who were brought together were the paramount distillers of Kentucky and Tennessee.
Wow.
The name brands, the Jimmy and Eddie Russells, the Parker Beams, the Jim Rutledges, and many others who were the monumental figures of whiskey making in this country. And so I was able to go down there and glean further information and knowledge from them. And I had already had an affinity for rye whiskey because I was born and raised in Maryland, where a lot of great American rye whiskey history is born. And most people don't know rye whiskey history predates bourbon by a century.
Wow.
And I love bourbon. I drink bourbon. We sell bourbon here at the bar. But when it came down to starting a business, I thought, well, one, if you go back to the 19th century cocktail energy and acumen, the brown spirit of choice was most often rye. It's got a slightly different flavor profile. We're talking about distilleries that were more Mid-Atlantic focused than, say, Southern focused. And rye was just a major crop of Maryland and Pennsylvania.
This is Michael. I just wanted to say how thrilled I am and excited that you're listening to Flipping the Table. These are the kinds of conversations I've wanted to share with people for a decade or more. So please like us, share with your friends, write a review, and subscribe.
The funny cultural thing about cocktails is the story of specific cocktails, or cocktails even generally, is usually shared on two sides of a bar. So there's oftentimes heavy drinking involved. So the stories are almost like a game of telephone. There's not one through line that says, we empirically know that they drank rye whiskey in the original Manhattan. We don't know. There are articles that might suggest rye or bourbon. But as a Marylander by birth, and as a cocktail historian, as much as a cocktail maker, I went with the rye story and said, boy, I think I can be maybe a bigger fish in a smaller pond if we focus on rye. And for the sake that now I'm talking about making it in New York and looking at the climate here and the soil composition here, soak it with rain, hail, drought. It withstands most of those things pretty heartily. And in the early days of the distillery, skipping around a little bit, I was spending a lot of time at Cornell University. And my partner, Tom, and I had contacted them to see if we could glean any interesting information, perhaps on the history of rye as it might pertain to New York State. And they came back to us with some pretty interesting information. They have a couple of guys, and they run their seed savers, if you will, for Cornell. And they said, well, we've identified 3 specific varieties that go back to the 18th century, maybe even 17th century New York.
Wow.
And we were able to get 10 seeds.
Really? Just 10?
10 taxpayer dollars at work. 10 seeds of these varieties, and 2 did not pass muster. They've got to go through a very specific agricultural protocol. We reconnected with a farmer I had been engaged with from an activity standpoint through Slow Food Days, Peterson Family Farms up in the southern Finger Lakes area. And we went through this protocol, and as I said, 2 didn't pass muster, so those went by the wayside, but 1 did. And it was the variety called Horton, of the Peter Horton family, original of Leicester, England, that moved to the colonies in the 1670s.
Wow.
And this was their family hybrid. So that set us off, hey, we've got to do rye. We have to, this is going to have a New York sensibility for us. And in the meantime, we developed a contemporary hybrid with Rick, our farmer up in the Finger Lakes, that we could manifest into our own rye whiskey, but we went very patiently and started planting Horton as well, this 17th, 18th century variety. And that's been 10 years in the making.
So you're propagating, you're
Correct.
creating more and more product.
We need
more
1 million seeds per acre.
Wow.
Just even at our little scale, to have enough to turn into whiskey ultimately.
Wow.
And so, that it speaks to a few things of provenance, knowing your farmer, what's going to grow properly or well in a specific region or micro region. And that speaks to the whiskey. The gin side became a different organism, really, because we decided early on we wanted to make, very simply, the best gin we could. We could drive out the Long Island Expressway in the summertime and pick juniper berries. But domestic juniper berries have a very different flavor to me than Northern European or Balkan juniper berries. And we said, no, it's just not the flavor we want. So our botanicals come from all over. We have some from New York. All of our citrus peels are organic from California. We have botanicals from the Caribbean, from North Africa, and all of our juniper berries are from the Balkans.
Wow. I was going to say, when I was here last, which was 4 or 5 years ago, I remember you had a big container with juniper berries. They were big berries, and they smelled so good. I remember.
It's still there.
It's still there. Good. We'll have to check that out. Yeah. I'll get a picture.
Yeah. It's not a big container, but the juniper berries are still there.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So anyway, go on. So, what year was that you actually? I know we were up to about 2002.
Sure. So again, I was wandering in a word I never use, but I will for conversation's sake, in a career sensibility. And I never really worried about it. It was never obligatory, whether based on my parents or my family. Make sure you can pay your bills, but find something you love to do. And I was still searching for that, but I was very much enjoying being in this either hospitality realm or consultancy realm vis-a-vis distilled spirits. And the bug had bit certainly by 2003. And the first conversations I really had in earnest about the New York Distilling Company, or what it's become, would have to be in 2008. And I had been thinking about it, but it was in late 2008 that I met my partner, Tom Potter, and we had enough similar ideas that we didn't dance around too long. We said, yeah, let's work on this together. And in conjunction with his son, we started working on some specific business plans of what it might be like to open a distillery in New York City. And for us specifically, that was Brooklyn. One, at the time, Tom lived in Brooklyn, and a lot of his life at that time, nearly 20 years, had been starting and running the Brooklyn Brewery. And we also wanted to look at Brooklyn because one of the interesting things is you just can't open a distillery anywhere. It really has to be in very specifically approved zoning for if not the heaviest manufacturing, pretty heavy manufacturing, because we're working with very high proof alcohol, whether by distillation or by storage. And so Brooklyn provided a lot of that space, and some relatively recent legislative changes in New York provided a unique opportunity for us to not only open a distillery, but by our choosing, have a bar attached to it.
And that's where we're sitting right
And
now.
we're sitting in the
shanty.
bar, in the shanty. And for us, and being in New York, look, we're not trying to get anybody drunk. We're really not. Anywhere in New York, except some club. But for us, it was a means of instant revenue. And that's why the state legislature enacted it. You can open a bar, or a tasting room, or a retail shop, provided that it's contiguous to your manufacturing space.
And that's what it
I can't open a bar across the street or at the Canadian border unless I open another distillery. And that's not happening. So
One's enough.
Yeah, one's enough. We said, hey, if we can open this and open a bar in a neighborhood where there's some foot traffic, well, we'll get people to know we exist. And we'll get people excited about the products that we're going to make. That being said, we serve products from all over the world, beer, wine, whatever it is. It's a neighborhood bar. And so we had some business plans in place. If I recall, we had three, a sort of drag ourselves to the gate, get it off the ground. If we can't raise a lot of money, excuse me, if we can't raise a lot of money, this will at least get us open for business. And there was a middle range and there was a high-end range. And this was basically in the through line of the height of the Great Recession.
All right.
And to our delight, and maybe even surprise, there's a lot of money out there. I guess there always is, there always will be. And the sales pitch was earnest, but it was taking people around to my favorite cocktail bars in New York City. And to relate that history, the contemporary cocktail movement in New York really begins in earnest in 1999, where there were two cocktail bars, Angel's Share in the East Village, and a wonderful bar that had no phone number and a hidden entrance called Milk and Honey on Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side.
Wow. Now, would you define for our listeners what defines a cocktail bar versus a bar?
Sure, well, it's evolving even as we sit here. But for the last semi-generation, the rejuvenation of cocktail culture has really looked specifically at a throwback. What did Americans drink at the height of what we would call the golden age of cocktail culture? The mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, up until Prohibition, when rather than shut the industry down altogether, the great bartenders of the great cities of this country went to Cuba and Paris and London and continued to evolve cocktail culture in those cities.
Wow.
So when we rediscover this American gastronomy that's taken, in my estimation, a 45-year arc from, if you want, the opening of Chez Panisse and an interest in the hyper-local. Who is my farmer? What is the seasonality of ingredients? And perhaps that movement begets an interest in wine culture as it relates to food, particularly California wine culture, beyond the rattan-wrapped bottle. Let's see what the provenance and flavor of individual grapes are. And that begets craft beer movements and culture, which isn't quite a straight through line, but still exists and is thriving now. There was one element left, and for me, the most American, and that was the cocktail culture. And so by the early aughties, cocktail bars are opening in New York City that almost exclusively have the feel of a speakeasy, because we're celebrating that old American heritage, or that element where Americans were crazy enough to ban alcohol and destroy our taste buds, whether it's for food, wine, beer, or spirits. And I always like to say, well, it took that 80-year period just to reclaim our taste buds and not look for insipidly sweet, whether it was food, but in my case, cocktails, overly sugared drinks, overly juiced drinks, or artificially juiced drinks, where now the trend is bracing sours. Things
Bracing
that
sours.
stimulate your taste buds and appetite, or bitter flavors that now we cook with, of course, but are also stimulating in beverages as well. And so, again, those early cocktail bars, Milk and Honey and Angel Share and Pegu Club and Clover Club and Death and Co. were all versions of let's step through a time warp and go back to the speakeasy and rediscover what Americans were drinking when they actually had authentic ingredients and authentic spirits. And we've evolved from that since to a holistic, organic movement toward just discovery of flavors, what works well together. And I would say even more than that 19th century era, that this surely is the most significant cocktail era in human history.
Now, and is that because we have more scientific knowledge about what's behind things, or is it because there are more artists that are in it?
So this period, in my estimation, is where it is for two reasons or three reasons. One, you have this desire to have these so-called, and I mean that sincerely, movements. There's a food movement, a culture movement, a cocktail movement. I'm not sure it is, but that's the phrase people like to use. Within that, no doubt, is social media. We are an interconnected world. I can push a button and talk to friends in Italy, China, Russia, Australia, and we can all be on a WhatsApp chat at the same time, simultaneously. Your new bar opened, it feels like you're there. And now people, trade cocktails equally instantaneously. Where it took it getting published somewhere, not just in the 19th century, but in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Oh, were you published in Gourmet Magazine or in the Chronicle or the New York Times or wherever? Oh yeah, you clipped it out and it was in your cocktail book or your recipe book. We have those books too. It's fun, but it really is nostalgic as opposed to finding everything in a database online. And I think in large part, you have a younger set of people who came of age without knowing that we had to reclaim our taste buds. And they've now come in tasting fresh ingredients at farmers markets, fresh ingredients at restaurants, whether it's a $7 bowl of ramen or the height of some fancy restaurant. I don't get the idea of taking pictures of everything you eat and drink, but if it brings someone pleasure and it's not a flash in my face, it doesn't bother me. But those things combined make this moment and one other that's influenced by the social media and millennials having been nearly born with mature taste buds. And that's created a moment where we have more access to more authentic ingredients than ever before. For 50 years, you could get rock and rye, but it was made with artificial flavor and artificial color. Wow. That was the trend. You'd get all these liqueurs as a popular category. They were wholesale artificial. Nobody cared, and that's where the insipidly sweet flavor came from as well. It's not just by ingredient, it's by wholesale category. There's never been so many gins, so many bourbons, so many vermouths. When I was first bartending in 1990, 91, there were like 2 or 3 vermouths. You can't count them now. I usually equate it to gin, since we make gin, but if you go to the largest store in Manhattan, when we opened New York Distilling Company 8 years ago, there was probably a dozen gins on the shelf. There are over 75 now.
Wow.
And this is in tight Manhattan real estate. This is not a huge footprint block store like a Bevmo or a Binny's in Chicago. This is not a huge footprint. And so having access to ingredients further feeds the interest of, what am I tasting? What else is there? Let's compare things. Let's taste in groups. And so as a point of discovery, the same as you might say, wow, apples are in season. Let's get a dozen different varieties. Well, let's taste a dozen different vermouths. How does that act with this dozen whiskeys in a Manhattan or an old-fashioned? Vermouth and whiskey, Manhattan, not old-fashioned. And the exponential discovery is really quite remarkable and fun.
So that is interesting because to me, it says to me there's something important about the complexity in our time. Because one of the things that I see going on in farming is that there is more, because of technology and because of science, there's deeper and deeper understanding what's actually happening
Sure.
in a farm, in the
Yeah.
soil, in the plant. Everything is like that now. And the knowledge explosion is incredible. And so it says to me, it's actually good that humans, through the world of cocktails, are indulging in that complexity.
Well, I'm talking about out of two sides of my mouth here, really. On the cocktail side, let's be honest, cocktails are a reward. We don't need them to survive the way we need food, but they're a reward of pleasure. You know, when people talk about healthy
But don't we need
cocktails,
pleasure?
we absolutely need pleasure. There's lots of forms, of course, but the development of our taste buds is key. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to make the connection of the scientific understanding of where limes or lemons or sugars are specifically coming from. Maybe limes, because we're challenged with limes and we have two distinctive seasons. We get limes here in New York from California in one season and Mexico in the other. And they taste very different. They cost a lot different price point. And so as cocktail culture has erupted here and in other cities too, of course, there's a very keen awareness, probably starting with the price point of when lime season changes. But I don't know if it digs down to, oh, there's a family that's actually planting lime trees. And if it's too hot, the limes are smaller. And if it doesn't get irrigated enough, the juice is not as plentiful.
You mean the people don't understand that?
I don't think they do.
And maybe they don't need to.
Then maybe they don't need to.
But you do.
But that, for me, on a personal level, comes from the distilling side of things, because we're working with specific farmers for all of our grains, and through botanical brokers, specific farmers for all of the botanicals that we use. So we're small here. We try to keep contracts on an annual or 18-month basis. So we know when farmers have had a tough season and the juniper harvests are not going to look so good as they might have for the last year or several. And we know that there's going to be an issue if the orange crop in California isn't going to be the same, because we talk to the people brokering with direct relationships on the farmers that we use to obtain these things.
Well, that's interesting because we now have this disease, the
Yeah.
greening,
Yep.
citrus greening disease. That's going to impact you eventually.
It likely will.
Wow. So it is, I bet most people don't think about the agricultural connection to spirits, but it's deep.
Well, it has to
an
be.
extension.
And by our choosing, we're an urban distillery. We love it. But when you go back to thinking, well, where is a distillery most well suited? It's really on a farm. And another
Which is where
movement.
George Washington.
Exactly. That's how, the distillery at Mount Vernon was created because they were able to grow their ingredients there. And that's a trend that is really gaining a new traction as well, not just here, but in Scotland and in the Cotswolds in England and other places that have interesting climate activity. But
They're opening micro distilleries?
they're opening they're either opening micro distilleries, or the distilling interest is driving specific relationships with farmers who are growing ingredients specifically for distilling purposes.
Where is the future of the industry? Is this trend towards specificity, provenance, authenticity, is that going to continue, or do you see it petering out? Where do you think it's going?
I certainly hope, but I really believe that interest in provenance is going to continue. So much that I've not staked the entire entity of New York Distilling Company on it, but going back to our rye whiskey endeavors, that we've helped create a category with other distillers in New York called Empire Rye, that has to be designed from grains grown in New York, distilled and aged for a specific prescribed period of time in New York.
Beautiful.
Now, I will say,
That's taking a card out of the wine industry.
it absolutely is. But there's AOCs and DOCs, and there's Tennessee whiskey. that's been around for decades as a designation. But that's my fervent desire, is to create a designation that even within it has some micro descriptors. We get all of our grains from the Finger Lakes, 300 plus miles from here. Someone else might get their grains from the Hudson Valley, 60, 70 miles from here. Will there be interesting differences between even those? Time will tell. But I'm very enthusiastic about celebrating and supporting the idea of that type of provenance with a marketing angle to it as well, because it gets state ag department very excited.
So you have to create a regulation. You're going to create a regulatory environment for this.
We have within the state of New York. It's not a national.
No, but yeah, but it's
yet. But within the state of New York, our state legislature and the governor have been very progressive and supportive on all things alcohol, frankly. But in our context, they're very excited about the context of Empire Rye, because we think it can be a category, and that rye whiskey from New York can be distinctive, not better than, but distinctive than rye, perhaps from Kentucky or Pennsylvania or California as an entity.
And do you worry about the competition that develops because you have such diversity, and like you said, 75 gins? Is that, as a business person, is that a challenge that worries you, keeps you up at night, or do you feel like it's good for the industry?
It does keep me up at night. It probably also, for the most part, is good for the industry. Who am I to judge anyone else? My applause, hugs, and wet kisses are for anyone who wants to make something themselves. We became manufacturers in an era where that's increasingly rare, that we simply derive basic pleasure from making something from scratch. And if someone else likes it, all the better. If they don't, they can say so, and I can take it. But those are the people I applaud most.
So tell us, so the audience knows, tell us your product line, and if it's possible for them, how they would get it.
Sure. Well, our product line is comprised of a couple of whiskeys. Ragtime Rye is our flagship rye. It's a blend of 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old rye whiskeys, all made by us and aged by us and blended by us. And then more recently, we've come out with a second iteration called Ragtime Rye Bottled in Bond, which is a style that dates back to 1897, that has its own prescription and set of standards that were created by the federal government that we adhere to. It's primarily a 4-year-old whiskey at 100 proof. And we'll come out with a third rye whiskey a year from now, and that's going to be based on that seed sample of 10 seeds from an 18th century variety of New York rye, that the working name is the Empiricist, based on our concept of Empire Rye. And then on the gin side, we have two, Dorothy Parker New York gin, which is a bit of a modern affectation. It's heavy on juniper berries, but it takes a little bit more of a tact of looking at the fruit quality of juniper berries than just the piney, resiny quality that people often associate, not just with the botanical, but with gin itself. And last but not least is Perry's Tot, a Navy strength gin at 114 proof.
And tell people why it's called Navy Strength. You told me this.
Sure, it's called, I mean, it's fun and it's true. It's called Navy Strength because centuries ago, the British devised that if by accident or otherwise you spilled your booze on gunpowder, you could still fire off your cannons. And we could easily say, well, who cares? And it's sort of a smirk and it's funny, but it's true because they paid their officers with daily rations of alcohol. It must have been the most miserable existence to be in the British Navy hundreds of years ago. And they had to protect that these casks of what was not only gin, but also Navy strength rum would not harm the gunpowder if they hit a rogue wave, if a bullet pierced a barrel, if someone was lonely and tried to thief some out of it, that if it spilled on the gunpowder, that ship in commission would still be able to fight in battle and not end up at the bottom of the Channel or the Atlantic Ocean. And I love the history of it. It's all true. However, if you go back 120 years ago, before Prohibition, Navy strength gin specifically was wildly popular in cocktails in New York and San Francisco and New Orleans and other cities internationally. And that's what really grasped me, that it was a lesser known style of gin, but that it was once easily very popular and significant in cocktail culture.
And that was because it has a more powerful flavor?
Well, you could say that. It has a more distinctive flavor in the context of its potency, but the real honest answer is, in mixing with it, we use less. So if a typical cocktail might be 2 ounces or 2.5 ounces of a base spirit, I'm only going to use 1.5 ounces of Navy strength gin. You will taste all of the ginniness and still be able to have your cocktail or two and still be able to have wine with your friends at dinner, and it won't knock you over. If you free pour it, it will be a short evening. That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
Well, and then how can people, I mean, I know you're distributed throughout New York and New Jersey. Where can people get
Yeah, you can find our products in California.
Good, where?
Here and there. You know, the key is that it's available. If any of those strike someone's interest, you have to ask for them. It's typically in cocktail bars and restaurant bars that serve cocktails, but it is distributed, and any store can simply look it up these days. It's that easy, and order it through a distributor. But otherwise, you can find us online, and in these days, even the shipping of alcohol has its roots. And if it's of interest, it's
People
accessible that way
go
too.
to your website and buy it off the website.
They can't buy it directly through us, but we can certainly guide them to places where they can purchase it online.
Right, because that's tied house law, right? Probably. yeah.
Depends on the state.
Depends on
Thank
the
you.
state, yeah.
The end of prohibition.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating. I really enjoyed hearing it, and I'm really happy for your success over
Thank
the
you.
years, all you've done here, and thank you for your time today.
Anytime.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.